Alright, I still have the ebook pulled up, but I do have the physical copy. So I'll be reading from this, and what is page 142 on here is page 150 on this. Recursion at the lowest level of matter. We have seen recursion in the grammars of languages. We have seen recursive geometrical trees which grow upwards forever, and we have seen one way in which recursion enters the theory of solid-state physics. Now we are going to see yet another way in which the whole world is built out of recursion. This has to do with the structure of elementary particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and the tiny quanta of electromagnetic radiation called photons. We are going to see that particles are, in a certain sense, which can only be defined rigorously in relativistic quantum mechanics, nested inside each other in a way which can be described recursively, perhaps even by some sort of grammar. We begin with the observation that if particles didn't interact with each other, things would be incredibly simple. Physicists would like such a world because then they could calculate the behavior of all particles easily. If physicists in such a world existed, which is a doubtful proposition. Particles without interactions are called bare particles, and they are purely hypothetical creations. They don't exist. Now when you turn on the interactions, then particles get tangled up together in the way that functions f and m are tangled together, or married people are tangled together. These real particles are said to be renormalized, an ugly but intriguing term. What happens is that no particle can even be defined without referring to all other particles, whose definitions in turn depend on the first particles, etc., round and round in a never-ending loop. Figure 34 shows a G-plot, a recursive graph showing energy bands for electrons in an idealized crystal in a magnetic field. A, or alpha, representing magnetic field strength, runs vertically from 0 to 1. Energy runs horizontally. The horizontal line segments are bands of allowed electron energies. This was referred to on a previous page as well. Let us be a little more concrete now. Let's limit ourselves to only two kinds of particles. Hey, welcome. Electrons and photons. I'm reading out loud this time. We'll also have to throw in the electron's antiparticle, the positron. Photons are their own antiparticles. Imagine first a dull world where a bare electron wishes to propagate from point A to point B, as Zeno did in my three-part invention. A physicist could draw a picture would draw a picture like this. There is a I forgot to switch the page here. There is a mathematical expression which corresponds to this line and its endpoints, and it is easy to write down. With it, a physicist can understand the behavior of the bare electron in this trajectory. Now let us turn on the electromagnetic interaction, whereby electrons and photons interact. Although there are no photons in the scene, there will nevertheless be profound consequences even for this simple trajectory. In particular, our electron now becomes capable of emitting and then reabsorbing virtual photons, photons which flicker in and out of existence before they can be seen. Let us show one such process. Now, as our electron propagates, it may emit and reabsorb one photon after another, or it may even nest them, as shown below. The mathematical expressions corresponding to these diagrams, called Feynman diagrams, are easy to write down, but they are harder to calculate than that for the bare electron. But what really complicates matters is that a photon, real or virtual, can decay for a brief moment into an electron-positron pair. Then these two annihilate each other, and, as if by magic, the original photon reappears. This sort of process is shown below. The electron has a right-pointing arrow, while the positron's arrow points leftwards. As you might have anticipated, these virtual processes can be nested inside each other to arbitrary depth. This can give rise to some very complicated-looking drawings, such as the one in figure 35. In that Feynman diagram, a single electron enters on the left at A, does some amazing acrobatics, and then a single electron emerges on the right at B. To an outsider who can't see the inner mess, it looks as if one electron has peacefully sailed from A to B. In the diagram, you can see how electron lines can get arbitrarily embellished, and so you can see the photon lines. This diagram would be ferociously hard to calculate. Figure 35. A Feynman diagram showing the propagation of a renormalized electron from A to B. In this diagram, time increases to the right. Therefore, in the segments where the electron's arrow points leftwards, it is moving backwards in time. A more intuitive way to say that this is that an anti-electron, or positron, is moving forwards in time. Photons are their own antiparticles, hence their lines have no need of arrows. This is a sort of grammar to these diagrams that only allows certain pictures to be realized in nature. For instance, the one below is impossible. You might say it is not a well-formed Feynman diagram. The grammar is a result of basic laws of physics, such as conservation of energy, conservation of electric charge, and so on. And, like the grammars of human languages, this grammar has a recursive structure, in that it allows deep nestings of structures inside each other. It would be possible to draw up a set of recursive transition networks defining the grammar of the electromagnetic interaction. When bare electrons or bare photons are allowed to interact in these arbitrarily entangled ways, the result is renormalized electrons and photons. Thus, to understand how a real physical electron propagates from A to B, the physicist has to be able to take a sort of average of all the infinitely many different possible drawings which involve virtual particles. This is Zeno with a vengeance. Thus, the point is that a physical particle, a renormalized particle, involves 1, a bare particle, and 2, a huge tangle of virtual particles, inextricably wound together in a recursive mess. Every real particle's existence, therefore, involves the existence of infinitely many other particles, contained in a virtual cloud which surrounds it as it propagates. And each of the virtual particles in the cloud, of course, also drags along its own virtual cloud, and so on ad infinitum. Particle physicists have found that this complexity is too much to handle, and in order to understand the behavior of electrons and photons, they use approximations which neglect all but fairly simple Feynman diagrams. Fortunately, the more complex a diagram, the less important its contribution. There is no way of summing up all of the infinitely many possible diagrams to get an expression for the behavior of a fully renormalized physical electron. But by considering roughly the simplest 100 diagrams for certain processes, physicists have been able to predict one value, the so-called G factor of the muon, to 9 decimal places, correctly. Renormalization takes place not only among electrons and photons. Whenever any types of particle interact together, physicists use the ideas of renormalization to understand the phenomena. Thus, protons and neutrons, neutrinos, pi mesons, quarks, all the beasts in the subnuclear zoo, they all have bare and renormalized versions in physical theories. And from billions of these bubbles within bubbles are all the beasts and baubles of the world composed. Copies and sameness. Let us now consider G-plot once again. You will remember that in the introduction we spoke of different varieties of canons. Each type of canon exploited some manner of taking an original theme and copying it by an isomorphism, or information-preserving transformation. Sometimes the copies were upside down, sometimes backwards, sometimes shrunken or expanded. In G-plot we have all those types of transformation and more. The mappings between the full G-plot and the copies of itself inside itself involve size changes, skewings, reflections, and more. And yet there remains a sort of skeletal identity, which the eye can pick up with a bit of effort, particularly after it has practiced with INT. Escher took the idea of an object's parts being copies of the object itself and made it into a print. His woodcut fishes and scales, figure 13. Of course, these fishes and scales are the same only when seen on a sufficiently abstract plane. Now everyone knows that a fish's scales aren't really small copies of the fish, and a fish's cells aren't small copies of the fish. However, a fish's DNA, sitting inside each and every one of the fish's cells, is a very convoluted copy of the entire fish. And so there is more than a grain of truth to the Escher picture. What is there that is the same about all butterflies? The mapping from one butterfly to another does not map cell onto cell. Rather, it It maps functional part onto functional part, and this may be partially on a macroscopic scale, partially on a microscopic scale. The exact proportions of parts are not preserved, just the functional relationships between parts. That is the type of isomorphism which links all butterflies in Escher's wood engraving butterflies, figure 37, to each other. The same goes for the more abstract butterflies of G-plot, which are all linked to each part by mathematical mappings that carry functional part onto functional part, but totally ignore exact line proportions, angles, and so on. Taking this exploration of sameness to a yet higher plane of abstraction, we might well ask, what is there that is the same about all Escher drawings? It would be quite ludicrous to attempt to map them piece by piece onto each other. The amazing thing is that even a tiny section of an Escher drawing or a Bach piece gives it away. Just as a fish's DNA is contained inside every tiny bit of fish, so a creator's signature is contained inside every tiny section of his creations. We don't know what to call it but style, a vague and elusive word. We keep on running up against sameness and differentness, and the question, when are two things the same? It will recur over and over again in this book. We shall come at it from all sorts of skew angles, and in the end we shall see how deeply this simple question is connected with the nature of intelligence. That this issue arose in the chapter on recursion is no accident, for recursion is a domain where sameness and differentness plays a central role. Recursion is based on the same thing happening on several different levels at once, but the events on different levels aren't exactly the same. Rather, we find some invariant feature in them, despite many ways in which they differ. For example, in the little harmonic labyrinth, all the stories on different levels are quite unrelated. Their sameness resides in only two facts. One, they are stories, and two, they involve the tortoise and Achilles. Other than that, they are radically different from each other. Programming and recursion, modularity, loops, procedures. One of the essential skills in computer programming is to perceive when two processes are the same in this extended sense, for that leads to modularization, the breaking up of a task into natural subtasks. For instance, one might want a sequence of many similar operations to be carried out one after another. Instead of writing them all out, one can write a loop, which tells the computer to perform a fixed set of operations, and then loop back and perform them again, over and over, until some condition is satisfied. Now, the body of the loop, the fixed set of instructions to be repeated, need not actually be completely fixed. It may vary in some predictable way. An example is the most simple-minded test for the primality of a natural number in which you begin by trying to divide n by 2, then by 3, 4, 5, etc., until n minus 1. If n has survived all these tests without being divisible, it's prime. Notice that each step in the loop is similar to, but not the same as, each other step. Notice also that the number of steps varies with n. Hence, a loop of fixed length could never work as a general test for primality. There are two criteria for aborting the loop. 1. If some number divides n exactly, quit with answer no. 2. If n minus 1 is reached as a test divisor and n survives, quit with answer yes. The general idea of loops, then, is this. Perform some series of related steps over and over and abort the process when specific conditions are met. Now, sometimes the maximum number of steps in a loop will be known in advance. Other times you just begin and wait until it is aborted. The second type of loop, which I call a free loop, is dangerous because the criterion for abortion may never occur, leaving the computer in a so-called infinite loop. This distinction between bounded loops and free loops is one of the most important concepts in all of computer science, and we shall devote an entire chapter to it. Bloop and floop and gloop. Now, loops may be nested inside each other. For instance, suppose that we wish to test all the numbers between 1 and 5,000 for primality. We can write a second loop which uses the above described test over and over, starting with n equals 1 and finishing with n equals 5,000. So our program will have a loop-the-loop structure. Such programming structures are typical. In fact, they are deemed to be good programming style. This kind of nested loop also occurs in assembly instructions for commonplace items, and in such activities as knitting or crocheting, in which very small loops are repeated several times in larger loops, which in turn are carried out repeatedly. While the result of a low-level loop might be no more than a couple of stitches, the result of a high-level loop might be a substantial portion of a piece of clothing. In music, too, nested loops often occur, as for instance when a small loop, is played several times in a row, perhaps displaced in pitch each new time. For example, the last movements of both the Prokofiev Fifth Piano Concerto and the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony contain excluded passages in which fast, medium, and slow scale loops are played simultaneously by different groups of instruments to great effect. The Prokofiev scales go up, the Rachmaninoff scales down. Take your pick. A more general notion than loop is that of subroutine or procedure, which we have already discussed somewhat. The basic idea here is that a group of operations are lumped together and considered a single unit with a name, such as the procedure or innate noun. As we saw in RTNs, procedures can call each other by name, and thereby express very concisely sequences of operations which are to be carried out. This is the essence of modularity in programming. Modularity exists, of course, in hi-fi systems, furniture, living cells, human society, wherever there is hierarchical organization. More often than not, one wants a procedure which will act variably, according to context. Such a procedure can either be given a way of peering out at what is stored in memory and selecting its actions accordingly, or it can be explicitly fed a list of parameters which guide its choice of what actions to make. Sometimes both of these methods are used. In RTN terminology, choosing the sequence of actions to carry out amounts to choosing which pathway to follow. An RTN which has been souped up with parameters and conditions that control the choice of pathways inside it is called an augmented transition network, ATN. A place where you might prefer ATNs to RTNs is in producing sensible, as distinguished from nonsensical, English sentences out of raw words, according to a grammar represented in a set of ATNs. The parameters and conditions would allow you to insert various semantic constraints so that random juxtapositions like a thankless brunch would be prohibited. More on this in Chapter 18, however. Recursion in chess programs. A classic example of a recursive procedure with parameters is one for choosing the best move in chess. The best move would seem to be the one which leaves your opponent in the toughest situation. Therefore, a test for goodness of a move is simply this. Pretend you've made the move and now evaluate the board from the point of view of your opponent. But how does your opponent evaluate the position? Well, he looks for his best move. That is, he mentally runs through all possible moves and evaluates them from what he thinks is your point of view, hoping they will look bad to you. But notice that we have now defined best move recursively. Simply using the maxim that what is best for one side is worst for the other, the recursive procedure which looks for the best move operates by trying a move and then calling on itself in the role of an opponent. As such, it tries another move and calls on itself in the role of its opponent's opponent, that is, itself. This recursion can go several levels deep, but it's got to bottom out somewhere. How do you evaluate a board position without looking ahead? There are a number of useful criteria for this purpose, such as simply the number of pieces on each side, the number and type of pieces under attack, the control of the center, and so on. By using this kind of evaluation at the bottom, the recursive move generator can pop back upwards and give an evaluation at the top level of each different move. One of the parameters in the self-calling, then, must tell how many moves to look ahead. The outermost call in the procedure will use some externally set value for this parameter. Thereafter, each time the procedure recursively calls itself, it must decrease this look-ahead parameter by 1. That way, when the parameter reaches 0, the procedure will follow the alternate pathway, the non-recursive evaluation. In this kind of game-playing program, each move investigated causes the generation of a so-called look-ahead tree, with the move itself as trunk, responses as main branches, counter-responses as subsidiary branches, and so on. In Figure 38, I have shown a simple look-ahead tree, depicting the start of a tic-tac-toe game. There is an art to figuring out how to avoid exploring every branch of a look-ahead tree out to its tip. In chess trees, people, not computers, seem to excel at this art. It is known that top-level players look ahead relatively little compared to the most chess programs. Yet the people are far better. In the early days of computer chess, people used to estimate that it would be 10 years until a computer or program was world champion. But after 10 years had passed, it seemed that the day a computer would become world champion was still more than 10 years away. This is just one more piece of evidence for the rather recursive Hofstadter's law. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. Figure 38 shows the branching tree of moves and counter moves at the start of a game of tic-tac-toe. Reminder that this book was written in 1979, or right? 1989? I don't know. I already forgot. Recursion and unpredictability. Now, what is the connection between the recursive processes of this chapter and the recursive sets of the preceding chapter? The answer involves the notion of a recursively enumerable set. For a set to be RE means that it can be generated from a set of starting points, axioms, by the repeated application of rules and inference. Thus, the set grows and grows, each new element being compounded somehow out of the previous elements, in a sort of mathematical snowball. But this is the essence of recursion, something being defined in terms of simpler versions of itself instead of explicitly. The Fibonacci numbers and the Lucas numbers are perfect examples of RE sets. Snowballing from two elements by a recursive rule into infinite sets. It is just a matter of convention to call an RE set, whose complement is also RE, recursive. Recursive enumeration is a process in which many new things emerge from old things by fixed rules. There seem to be many surprises in such processes, for example, the unpredictability of the Q sequence. It might seem recursively defined sequences of that type possess some sort of inherently increasing complexity of behavior, so that the further out you go, the less predictable they get. This kind of thought, carried a little further, suggests that suitably complicated recursive systems might be strong enough to break out of any predetermined patterns. And isn't this one of the defining properties of intelligence? Instead of just considering programs composed of procedures which can recursively call themselves, why not get really sophisticated and invent programs which can modify themselves? Programs which can act on programs, extending them, improving them, generalizing them, fixing them, and so on. This kind of tangled recursion probably lies at the heart of intelligence. Be right back. I gotta drink water. Canon by intervallic augmentation. Achilles and the tortoise have just finished a delicious Chinese banquet for two at the best Chinese restaurant in town. You wield a mean chopstick, Mr. T. I ought to. Ever since my youth, I have had a fondness for Oriental cuisine. And you, did you enjoy your meal, Achilles? Immensely. I had not eaten Chinese food before. This meal was a splendid introduction. And now, are you in a hurry to go, or shall we just sit here and talk a little while? I'd love to talk while we drink our tea. Waiter. A waiter comes up. Could we have our bill, please, and some more tea? The waiter rushes off. You may know more about Chinese cuisine than I do, Mr. T, but I'll bet I know more about Japanese poetry than you do. Have you ever read any haiku? I'm afraid not. What is a haiku? A haiku is a Japanese 17-syllable poem, or mini-poem, rather, which is evocative in some way. Perhaps as a fragrant rose petal is, or a lily pond in a light drizzle. It generally consists of groups of 5, then 7, then 5 syllables. Such compressed poems with 17 syllables can't have much meaning. Meaning lies as much in the mind of the reader as in the haiku. That's an evocative statement. The waiter arrives with their bill, another pot of tea, and 2 fortune cookies. Thank you, waiter. Care for more tea, Achilles? Please. Those little cookies look delicious. Picks one up, bites into it, and begins to chew. Hey, what's this funny thing inside? A piece of paper? That's your fortune, Achilles. Many Chinese restaurants give out fortune cookies with their bills as a way of softening the blow. If you frequent Chinese restaurants, you come to think of fortune cookies less as cookies than as message bearers. Unfortunately, you seem to have swallowed some of your fortune. What does the rest say? It's a little strange, for all the letters are run together, with no spaces in between. Perhaps it needs decoding in some way? Oh, now I see. If you put the spaces back in where they belong, it says, 1 war, 2 ear, you. I can't quite make head or tail of that. Maybe it was a haiku-like poem, of which I ate the majority of syllables. In that case, your fortune is now a mere 5/17 of haiku, and a curious image it evokes. If 5/17 haiku is a new art form, then I'd say, whoa, oh, woe are we. May I look at it? Handing the tortoise the small slip of paper. Certainly. Yeah, okay. Why, when I decode it, Achilles, it comes out completely different. It's not a 5/17 haiku at all. It is a 6-syllable message which says, oh new art, woe are we. That sounds like an insightful commentary on the new art form of 5/17 haiku. You're right. Isn't it astonishing that the poem contains its own commentary? All I did was shift the reading frame by 1 unit, that is, shift all the spaces 1 unit to the right. Let's see what your fortune says, Mr. Tortoise. Tortoise, deftly splitting open his cookie, reads, fortune lies as much in the hand of the eater as in the cookie. Your fortune is also a haiku, Mr. Tortoise. At least it's got 17 syllables in the 5/75 form. Glory be! I would never have noticed that, Achilles. It's the kind of thing only you would have noticed. What struck me more is what it says, which of course is open to interpretation. I guess it just shows that each of us has his own characteristic way of interpreting messages which we run across. Idly, Achilles gazes at the tea leaves on the bottom of his empty teacup. More tea, Achilles? Yes, thank you. By the way, how is your friend the crab? I've been thinking about him a lot since you told me of your peculiar phonograph battle. I told him about you too, and he is quite eager to meet you. He's getting along just fine. In fact, he recently made a new acquisition in the record player line, a rare type of jukebox. Oh, would you tell me about it? I find jukeboxes, with their flashing colored lights and silly songs, so quaint and reminiscent of bygone eras. This jukebox is too large to fit in his house, so he had a shed specially built in back for it. I can't imagine why it would be so large, unless it has an unusually large selection of records. Is that it? As a matter of fact, it has exactly 1 record. What? A jukebox with only 1 record? That's a contradiction in terms. Why is the jukebox so big then? Is its single record gigantic? 20 feet in diameter? No, it's just a regular jukebox style record. Now, Mr. Tortoise, you must be joshing me. After all, what kind of a jukebox is it that has only a single song? Who said anything about a single song, Achilles? Every jukebox I've ever run into obeyed the fundamental jukebox axiom, 1 record, 1 song. This jukebox is different, Achilles. The 1 record sits vertically suspended, and behind it there is a small but elaborate network of overhead rails, from which hang various record players. When you push a pair of buttons, such as B1, that selects one of the record players. This triggers an automatic mechanism that starts the record player squeakily rolling out along the rusty tracks. It gets shunted up alongside the record, then it clicks into playing position. And then the record begins spinning and music comes out, right? Not quite. The record stands still. It's the record player which rotates. I might have known. But how, if you have but 1 record to play, can you get more than 1 song out of this crazy contraption? I myself asked the crab that question. He merely suggested that I try it out, so I fished a quarter from my pocket. You get 3 plays for a quarter. Stuffed it in the slot and hit buttons B1, then C3, then B10, all just at random. So phonograph B1 came sliding down the rail, I suppose, and plugged itself into the vertical record and began spinning? Exactly. The music that came out was quite agreeable, based on the famous old tune Bach, which I believe you remember. Oh, I never started it? Oh no. How long has the stream been going? Could I ever forget it? This was record player B1. Then it finished, and was slowly rolled back into its hanging position so that C3 could be slid into position. Now, don't tell me that C3 played another song. It did just that. Ah, I understand. It played the flip side of the first song, or another band on the same side. No, the record has grooves only on one side, and has only a single band. I don't understand that at all. You can't pull different songs out of the same record. That's what I thought until I saw Mr. Krabs' jukebox. How did the second song go? That's the interesting thing. It was a song based on the melody C-A-G-E. That's a totally different melody. True. And isn't John Cage a composer of modern music? I seem to remember reading about him in one of my books on haiku. Exactly. He has composed many celebrated pieces, such as 4 foot 33 inches, a 3-movement piece consisting of silences on is it 433? I guess it's 433, sorry. A 3-movement piece consisting of silences on different lengths. It's wonderfully expressive if you like that sort of thing. I can see where if I were in a loud and brash cafe, I might gladly pay to hear Cage's 433 on a jukebox. I might afford some relief. Right. Who wants to hear the racket of clinking dishes and jangling silverware? By the way, another place where 433 would come in handy is in the Hall of Big Cats at feeding time. Are you suggesting that Cage belongs in the zoo? Well, I guess that makes some sense, but about the Krabs' jukebox, I am baffled. How could both Bach and Cage be coded into a single record at once? You may notice that there is some relation between the two Achilles, if you inspect them carefully. Let me point the way. What do you get if you list the successive intervals in the melody B-A-C-H? Let me see. First it goes down one semitone, from B to A, where B is taken the German way. Then it rises 3 semitones to C, and finally it falls 1 semitone to H. That yields the pattern -1 plus 3 minus 1. Precisely. What about Cage now? C-A-G-E. Well, in this case, it begins by falling 3 semitones, then rises 10 semitones, nearly an octave, and finally falls 3 more semitones. That means the pattern is -3, +10, -3. It's very much like the other one, isn't it? Indeed it is. They have exactly the same skeleton, in a certain sense. You can make C-A-G-E out of B-A-C-H by multiplying all the intervals by 3 1/3 and taking the nearest whole number. Well, blow me down and pick me up. So does that mean that only some sort of skeletal code is present in the grooves, and that the various record players add their own interpretations to that code? I don't know for sure. The cagey crab wouldn't fill me in on all the details, but I did get to hear a third song, when record player B10 swiveled into place. How did it go? The melody consisted of enormously wide intervals and went B, C, A, H. The interval pattern in semitones was -10, +33, -10. It can be gotten from the Cage pattern by yet another multiplication by 3 1/3 and rounding to whole numbers. Is there a name for this kind of interval multiplication? One could call it intervallic augmentation. It is similar to the canonic vice of temporal augmentation, where all the time values of notes in a melody get multiplied by some constant. There, the effect is just to slow the melody down. Here, the effect is to expand the melodic range in a curious way. Amazing. So all 3 melodies you tried were intervallic augmentations of one single underlying groove pattern in the record. That's what I concluded. I find it curious that when you augment Bach, you get Cage, and when you augment Cage over again, you get Bach back, except jumbled up inside, as if Bach had an upset stomach after passing through the intermediate stage of Cage. That sounds like an insightful commentary on the new art form of Cage. Chapter 6. The Location of Meaning. When is one thing not always the same? Last chapter, we came upon the question, when are two things the same? In this chapter, we will deal with the flip side of that question. When is one thing not always the same? The issue we are broaching is whether meaning can be said to be inherent or in a message, or whether meaning is always manufactured by the interaction of a mind or a mechanism with a message, as in the preceding dialogue. In the latter case, meaning could not be said to be located in any single place, nor could it be said that a message has any universal or objective meaning, since each observer could bring its own meaning to each message. But in the former case, meaning could have both location and universality. In this chapter, I want to present the case for the universality of at least some messages, without, to be sure, claiming it for all messages. The idea of an objective meaning of a message will turn out to be related, in an interesting way, to the simplicity with which intelligence can be described. Information bearers and information revealers. I'll begin with my favorite example, the relationship between records, music, and record players. We feel quite comfortable with the idea that a record contains the same information as a piece of music, because of the existence of record players, which can read records and convert the groove patterns into sounds. In other words, there is an isomorphism between groove patterns and sounds, and the record player is a mechanism which physically realizes that isomorphism. It is natural then to think of the record as an information bearer, and the record player as an information revealer. A second example of these notions is given by the PQ system. There, the information bearers are the theorems, and the information revealer is the interpretation, which is so transparent that we don't need any electrical machine to help us extract the information from PQ theorems. One gets the impression from these two examples that isomorphisms and decoding mechanisms, i.e. information revealers, simply reveal information which is intrinsically inside the structures, waiting to be pulled out. This leads to the idea that for each structure there are certain pieces of information which can be pulled out of it, while there are other pieces of information which cannot be pulled out of it. But what does this phrase "pull out" really mean? How hard are you allowed to pull? There are cases where by investing sufficient effort you can pull very recondite pieces of information out of certain structures. In fact, the pulling out may involve such complicated operations that it makes you feel you are putting in more information than you are pulling out. Genotype and phenotype. Take the case of the genetic information commonly said to reside in the double helix of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. A molecule of DNA, a genotype, is converted into a physical organism, a phenotype, by a very complex process involving the manufacture of proteins, the replication of the DNA, the replication of cells, the gradual differentiation of cell types, and so on. Incidentally, this unrolling of phenotype from genotype, epigenesis, is the most tangled of tangled recursions, and in chapter 16 we shall devote our full attention to it. Epigenesis is guided by a set of enormously complex cycles of chemical reactions and feedback loops. By the time the full organism has been constructed, there is not even the remotest similarity between its physical characteristics and its genotype. And yet, it is standard practice to attribute the physical structure of the organism to the structure of its DNA, and to that alone. The first evidence for this point of view came from experiments conducted by Oswald Avery in 1946, and overwhelming corroborative evidence which has since been amassed. Avery's experiments showed that of all the biological molecules, only DNA transmits hereditary properties. One can modify other molecules in an organism, such as proteins, but such modifications will not be transmitted to later generations. However, when DNA is modified, all successive generations inherit the modified DNA. Such experiments show that the only way of changing the instructions for building a new organism is to change the DNA, and this, in turn, implies that those instructions must be coded somehow in the structure of the DNA. Exotic and prosaic isomorphisms. Therefore, one seems forced into accepting the idea that the DNA structure contains the information of the phenotype structure, which is to say the two are isomorphic. However, the isomorphism is an exotic one, by which I mean that it is highly non-trivial to divide the phenotype and genotype into parts, which can be mapped onto each other. Prosaic isomorphisms, by contrast, would be ones in which the parts of one structure are easily mappable onto the parts of the other. An example is the isomorphism between a record and piece of music, where one knows that to any sound in the piece there exists an exact image in the patterns etched into the grooves, and one could pinpoint it arbitrarily accurately if the need arose. Another prosaic isomorphism is that between G-plot and any of its internal butterflies. The isomorphism between DNA structure and phenotype structure is anything but prosaic, and the mechanism which carries it out physically is awesomely complicated. For instance, if you wanted to find some piece of your DNA which accounts for the shape of your nose or the shape of your fingerprint, you would have a very hard time. It would be a little like trying to pin down the note in a piece of music, which is the carrier of the emotional meaning of the piece. Of course, there is no such note, because the emotional meaning is carried on a very high level, by large chunks of the piece, not by single notes. Incidentally, such chunks are not necessarily sets of contiguous notes. There may be disconnected sections which, taken together, carry some emotional meaning. Similarly, genetic meaning, that is, information about phenotype structure, is spread all through the small parts of a molecule of DNA. Although nobody understands the language yet, warning, understanding this language would not at all be the same as cracking the genetic code, something which took place in the early 1960s. The genetic code tells how to translate short portions of DNA into various amino acids. Thus, cracking the genetic code is comparable to figuring out the phonetic values of the letters of a foreign alphabet, without figuring out the grammar of the language or the meanings of any of its words. The cracking of the genetic code was a vital step on the way to extracting the meaning of DNA strands, but it was only the first on a long path which is yet to be trodden. Jukeboxes and triggers. The genetic meaning contained in DNA is one of the best possible examples of implicit meaning. In order to convert genotype into phenotype, a set of mechanisms far more complex than the genotype must operate on the genotype. The various parts of the genotype serve as triggers for those mechanisms. A jukebox, the ordinary type, not the crab type, provides a useful analogy here. A pair of buttons specifies a very complex action to be taken by the mechanism, so that the pair of buttons could well be described as triggering the song which is played. In the process which converts genotype into phenotype, cellular jukeboxes, if you will pardon the notion, accept button pushings from short excerpts from a long strand of DNA, and the songs which they play are often prime ingredients in the creation of further jukeboxes. It is as if the output of real jukeboxes, instead of being love ballads, were songs whose lyrics told how to build more complex jukeboxes. Portions of the DNA trigger the manufacture of proteins. Those proteins triggered hundreds of new reactions. They in turn trigger the replicating operation, which in several steps copies the DNA, and on and on. This gives a sense of how recursive the whole process is. The final result of these many triggerings is the phenotype, the individual, and one says that the phenotype is the revelation, the pulling out of the information that was present in the DNA to start with latently. The term revelation in this context is due to Jacques Monod, one of the deepest and most original of 20th century molecular biologists. Now, no one would say that a song coming out of the loudspeaker of a jukebox constitutes a revelation of information inherent in the pair of buttons which were pressed, for the pair of buttons seem to be mere triggers whose purpose is to activate information-bearing portions of the jukebox mechanism. On the other hand, it seems perfectly reasonable to call the extraction of music from a record a revelation of information inherent in the record for several reasons. 1. The music does not seem to be concealed in the mechanism of the record player. 2. It is possible to match pieces of the input, the record, with pieces of the output, the music, to an arbitrary degree of accuracy. 3. It is possible to play other records on the same record player and get other sounds out. 4. The record and the record player are easily separated from one another. It is another question altogether whether the fragments of a smashed record contain intrinsic meaning. The edges of the separated pieces fit together and in that way allow the information to be reconstituted. But something much more complex is going on here. Then there is the question of the intrinsic meaning of a scrambled telephone call. There is a vast spectrum of degrees of inherency of meaning. It is interesting to try to place epigenesis in this spectrum. As development of an organism takes place, can it be said that the information is being pulled out of its DNA? Is that where all of the information about the organism structure resides? DNA and the necessity of chemical context. In one sense, the answer seems to be yes, thanks to experiments like Avery's, but in another sense, the answer seems to be no, because so much of the pulling out process depends on extraordinarily complicated cellular chemical processes, which are not coded for in the DNA itself. The DNA relies on the fact that they will happen, but does not seem to contain any code which brings them about. Thus, we have two conflicting views on the nature of the information in a genotype. One view says that so much of the information is outside the DNA that it is not reasonable to look upon the DNA as anything more than a very intricate set of triggers, like a sequence of buttons to be pushed on a jukebox. Another view says that the information is all there, but in a very implicit form. Now, it might seem that these are just two ways of saying the same thing, but that is not necessarily so. One view says that the DNA is quite meaningless out of context. The other says that even if it were taken out of context, a molecule of DNA from a living being that has such a compelling inner logic to its structure that its message could be deducted anyway. To put it as succinctly as possible, one view says that in order for DNA to have meaning, chemical context is necessary, and the other view says that only intelligence is necessary to reveal the intrinsic meaning of a strand of DNA. An unlikely UFO. We can get some perspective on this issue by considering a strange hypothetical event. A record of David Oistrakh and Lev Oborin playing Bach's Sonata in F minor for violin and clavier is sent up in a satellite. From the satellite, it is then launched on a course which will carry it outside of the solar system, perhaps out of the entire galaxy. Just a thin plastic platter with a hole in the middle, swirling its way through intergalactic space. It has certainly lost its context. How much meaning does it carry? If an alien civilization were to encounter it, they would almost certainly be struck by its shape, and would probably be very interested in it. Thus, immediately, its shape, acting as a trigger, has given them some information. That it is an artifact, perhaps an information-bearing artifact. This idea, communicated or triggered by the record itself, now creates a new context in which the record will henceforth be perceived. The next steps in the decoding might take considerably longer, but that is very hard for us to assess. We can imagine that if such a record had arrived on Earth in Bach's time, no one would have known what to make of it, and very likely it would not have gotten deciphered. But that does not diminish our conviction that the information was in principle there. We just know that human knowledge in those times was not very sophisticated with respect to the possibilities of storage, transformation, and revelation of information. Levels of understanding of a message. Nowadays, the idea of decoding is extremely widespread. It is a significant part of the activity of astronomers, linguists, archaeologists, military specialists, and so on. It is often suggested that we may be floating in a sea of radio messages from other civilizations, messages which we do not yet know how to decipher. And much serious thought has been given to the techniques of deciphering such a message. One of the main problems, perhaps the deepest problem, is the question, how will we recognize the fact that there is a message at all? How to identify a frame? The sending of a record seems to be a simple solution. Its gross physical structure is very attention-drawing, and it is at least plausible to us that it would trigger in any sufficiently great intelligence the idea of looking for information hidden in it. However, for technological reasons, sending of solid objects to other star systems seems to be out of the question. Still, that does not prevent our thinking about the idea. Now, suppose that an alien civilization hit upon the idea that the appropriate mechanism for translation of the record is a machine which converts the groove patterns into sounds. This would still be a far cry from a true deciphering. What, indeed, would constitute a successful deciphering of such a record? Evidently, the civilization would have to be able to make sense out of the sounds. Mere production of sounds is in itself hardly worthwhile, unless they have the desired triggering effect in the brains, if that is the word, of the alien creatures. And what is that desired effect? It would be to activate structures in their brains which create emotional efforts in them which are analogous to the emotional effects which we experience in hearing the piece. In fact, the production of sounds could even be bypassed, provided that they use the record in some other way to get at the appropriate structures in their brains. If we humans had a way of triggering the appropriate structures in our brains in sequential order, as music does, we might be quite content to bypass the sounds. But it seems extraordinarily unlikely that there is any way to do that other than via our ears. Deaf composers, Beethoven, Dvorak, Fauré, or musicians who can hear music by looking at a score, do not give the lie to this assertion, for such abilities are founded upon preceding decades of direct auditory experience. Here is where things become very unclear. Will beings of an alien civilization have emotions? Will their emotions, supposing they have some, be mappable in any sense onto ours? If they do have emotions somewhat like ours, do the emotions cluster together in somewhat the same way as ours do? Will they understand such amalgams as tragic beauty or courageous suffering? If it turns out that beings throughout the universe do share cognitive structures with us to the extent that even emotions overlap, then in some sense the record can never be out of its natural context. That context is part of the scheme of things, in nature, and if such is the case, then it is likely that a meandering record, if not destroyed en route, would eventually get picked up by a being or group of beings and get deciphered in a way which we would consider successful. Imaginary spacescape. In asking about the meaning of a molecule of DNA above, I used the phrase compelling inner logic, and I think this is a key notion. To illustrate this, let us slightly modify our hypothetical record into space event by substituting John Cage's Imaginary Landscape No. 4 for the Bach. This piece is a classic of aleatoric and chance music. This piece is a classic of aleatoric or chance music. Music whose structure is chosen by various random processes, rather than by an attempt to convey a personal emotion. In this case, 24 performers attach themselves to the 24 knobs on 12 radios. For the duration of the piece, they twiddle their knobs in aleatoric ways, so that each radio randomly gets louder and softer, switching stations all the while. The total sound produced is the piece of music. Cage's attitude is expressed in his own words, to let sounds be themselves, rather than vehicles for man-made theories or expressions of human sentiments. Now imagine that this is the piece on the record sent out into space. It would be extraordinarily unlikely, if not downright impossible, for an alien civilization to understand the nature of the artifact. They would probably be very puzzled by the contradiction between the frame message, "I am a message, decode me," and the chaos of the inner structure. There are few chunks to seize onto in this Cage piece, few patterns which could guide a decipherer. On the other hand, there seems to be in a Bach piece much to seize onto, patterns of patterns, and so on. We have no way of knowing whether such patterns are universally appealing. We do not know enough about the nature of intelligence, emotions, or music to say whether the inner logic of a piece by Bach is so universally compelling that its meaning could span galaxies. However, whether Bach in particular has enough inner logic is not the issue here. The issue is whether any message has, per se, enough compelling inner logic that its context will be restored automatically whenever intelligence of a high enough level comes into contact with it. If some message did have that context restoring property, then it would seem reasonable to consider the meaning of the message as an inherent property of the message. The heroic decipherers. Another illuminating example of these ideas is the decipherment of ancient texts written in unknown languages and unknown alphabets. The intuition feels that there is information inherent in such texts, whether or not we succeed in revealing it. It is as strong a feeling as the belief that there is inherent meaning in a newspaper written in Chinese, even if we are completely ignorant of Chinese. Once the script or language of a text has been broken, then no one questions where the meaning resides. Clearly, it resides in the text, not in the method of decipherment. Just as music resides in a record, not inside a record player. One of the ways that we identify decoding mechanisms is by the fact that they do not add any meaning to the signs or objects which they take as input. They merely reveal the intrinsic meaning of those signs or objects. A jukebox is not a decoding mechanism, for it does not reveal any meaning belonging to its input symbols. On the contrary, it supplies meaning concealed inside itself. Now, the decipherment of an ancient text may have involved decades of labor by several rival teams of scholars, drawing on knowledge stored in libraries all over the world. Doesn't this process add information too? Just how intrinsic is the meaning of a text when such mammoth efforts are required in order to find the decoding rules? Has one put meaning into the text, or was that meaning already there? My intuition says that the meaning was always there, and that despite the arduousness of the pulling out process, no meaning was pulled out that wasn't in the text to start with. This intuition comes mainly from one fact. I feel that the result was inevitable, that had the text not been deciphered by this group at this time, it would have been deciphered by that group at that time, and it would have come out the same way. That is why the meaning is part of the text itself. It acts upon intelligence in a predictable way. Generally, we can say meaning is part of an object to the extent that it acts upon intelligence in a predictable way. In Figure 9 is shown the Rosetta Stone, one of the most precious of all historical discoveries. It was the key to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, for it contains parallel text in 3 ancient scripts: hieroglyphics, Demotic characters, and Greek. The inscription on this basalt stele was first deciphered in 1821 by Jean-François Champollion, the father of Egyptology. It is a decree of priests assembled at Memphis in favor of Ptolemy V of Epiphanes, or Ptolemy V Epiphanes. 3 layers of any message. In these examples of decipherment of out-of-context messages, we can separate out fairly clearly 3 levels of information. 1, the frame message. 2, the outer message. 3, the inner message. The one we are most familiar with is 3, the inner message. It is the message which is supposed to be transmitted, the emotional experiences in music, the phenotype in genetics, the royalty and rights of ancient civilizations in tablets, etc. To understand the inner message is to have extracted the meaning intended by the sender. The frame message is the message, I am a message, decode me if you can, and it is implicitly conveyed by the gross structural aspects of any information bearer. To understand the frame message is to recognize the need for a decoding mechanism. If the frame message is recognized as such, then attention is switched to level 2, the outer message. This is information implicitly carried by symbol patterns and structures in the message, which tells how to decode the inner message. To understand the outer message is to build or know how to build the correct decoding mechanism for the inner message. This outer level is per force an implicit message, in the sense that the sender cannot ensure that it will be understood. It would be a vain effort to send instructions which tell how to decode the outer message, for they would have to be part of the inner message, which can only be understood once the decoding mechanism has been found. For this reason, the outer message is necessarily a set of triggers, rather than a message which can be revealed by a known decoder. The formulation of these 3 layers is only a rather crude beginning at analyzing how meaning is contained in messages. There may be layers and layers of outer and inner messages, rather than just one of each. Think, for instance, of how intricately tangled are the inner and outer messages of the Rosetta Stone. To decode a message fully, one would have to reconstruct the entire semantic structure which underlay its creation, and thus to understand the sender in every deep way. Hence, one could throw away the inner message, because if one truly understood all the finesses of the outer message, the inner message would be reconstructible. The book After Babel by George Steiner is a long discussion of the interaction between inner and outer messages, though he never uses that terminology. The tone of his book is given by this quote: "We normally use a shorthand beneath which there lies a wealth of subconscious, deliberately concealed or declared associations so extensive and intricate that they probably equal the sum and uniqueness of our status as an individual person. Thoughts along the same lines are expressed by Leonard B. Meyer in his book Music, the Arts, and Ideas. The way of listening to a composition by Elliott Carter is radically different from the way of listening appropriate to a work by John Cage. Similarly, a novel by Beckett must in a significant sense be read differently from one by Bellow. A painting by Willem de Kooning and one by Andy Warhol require different perceptual cognitive attitudes. Perhaps works of art are trying to convey their style more than anything else. In that case, if you could ever plumb a style to its very bottom, you could dispense with the creations in that style. Style, outer message, decoding technique, all ways of expressing the same basic idea. Schrödinger's aperiodic crystals. What makes us see a frame message in certain objects but not in others? Why should an alien civilization suspect, if they intercept an errant record, that a message lurks within? What would make a record any different from a meteorite? Clearly, its geometric shape is the first clue that something funny is going on. The next clue is that on a more microscopic scale, it consists of a very long aperiodic sequence of patterns arranged in a spiral. If we were to unwrap the spiral, we would have one huge linear sequence around 2,000 feet long of minuscule symbols. This is not so different from a DNA molecule, whose symbols, drawn from a meager alphabet of 4 different chemical bases, are arrayed in a one-dimensional sequence and then coiled up into a helix. Before Avery had established the connection between genes and DNA, the physicist Erwin Schrödinger predicted on purely theoretical grounds that genetic information would have to be stored in aperiodic crystals in his influential book, What is Life? In fact, books themselves are aperiodic crystals contained inside neat geometrical forms. These examples suggest that where an aperiodic crystal is found packaged inside a very regular geometric structure, there may lurk an inner message. I don't claim this is a complete characterization of frame messages, however. It is a fact that many common messages have frame messages of this description. See Figure 40 for some good examples. Languages for the 3 levels. The 3 levels are very clear in the case of a message found in a bottle washed up on a beach. The first level, the frame message, is found when one picks up the bottle and sees that it is sealed and contains a dry piece of paper. Even without seeing writing, one recognizes this type of artifact as an information bearer, and at this point it would take an extraordinarily, almost inhuman lack of curiosity to drop the bottle and not look further. Next, one opens the bottle and examines the marks on the paper. Perhaps they are in Japanese. This can be discovered without any of the inner message being understood. It merely comes from a recognition of the characters. The outer message can be stated as an English sentence. I am in Japanese. Once this has been discovered, then one can proceed to the inner message, which may be a call for help, a haiku poem, or a lover's lament. It would be of no use to include in the inner message a translation of the sentence, "This message is in Japanese," since it would take someone who knew Japanese to read it. And before reading it, he would have to recognize the fact that, as it is in Japanese, he can read it. You might try to wriggle out of this by including translations of this statement, "This message is in Japanese," into many different languages. That would help in a practical sense, but in a theoretical sense, the same difficulty is there. An English-speaking person still has to recognize the Englishness of the message, otherwise it does no good. Thus, one cannot avoid the problem that one has to find out how to decipher the inner message from the outside. The inner message itself may provide clues and confirmations, but those are at best triggers acting upon the bottle finder or upon the people whom he enlists to help. Similar kinds of problem confront the shortwave radio listener. First, he has to decide whether the sounds he hears actually constitute a message or are just static. The sounds in themselves do not give the answer, not even in the unlikely case that the inner message is in the listener's own native language and is saying, "These sounds actually constitute a message and are not just static." If the listener recognizes a frame message in the sounds, then he tries to identify the language the broadcast is in, and clearly, he is still on the outside. He accepts triggers from the radio, but they cannot explicitly tell him the answer. Figure 40 shows a collage of scripts. Uppermost on the left is an inscription in the undeciphered Boustrophedonic writing system from Easter Island, in which every second line is upside down. The characters are chiseled on a wooden tablet, 4 inches by 35 inches. Moving clockwise, we encounter vertically written Mongolian, above present-day Mongolian, and below a document dating from 1314. Then we come to a poem in Bengali by Rabindranath Tagore in the bottom right-hand corner. Next to it is a newspaper headline in Malayalam, West Kerala, southern India, above which is the elegant curvilinear language Tamil, East Kerala. The smallest entry is part of a folk tale in Bujanese, Celebes Island, Indonesia. In the center of the collage is a paragraph in the Thai language, and above it a manuscript in runic dating from the 14th century, containing a sample of the provincial law of Scania, South Sweden. Finally, wedged in on the left is a section of the laws of Hammurabi, written in Assyrian cuneiform. As an outsider, I feel a deep sense of mystery as I wonder how meaning is cloaked in the strange curves and angles of each of these beautiful aperiodic crystals. In form, there is content, from Hans Jensen, sign, symbol, and script. A bunch of references. Okay. It is in the nature of outer messages that they are not conveyed in any explicit language. To find an explicit language in which to convey outer messages would not be a breakthrough. It would be a contradiction in terms. It is always the listener's burden to understand the outer message. Success lets him break through into the inside, at which point the ratio of triggers to explicit meanings shifts drastically towards the latter. By comparison with the previous stages, understanding the inner message seems effortless, it is as if it just gets pumped in. The jukebox theory of meaning. These examples may appear to be evidence for the viewpoint that no message has intrinsic meaning. For in order to understand any inner message, no matter how simple it is, one must first understand its frame message and its outer message, both of which are carried only by triggers such as being written in the Japanese alphabet or having spiraling grooves, etc. It begins to seem, then, that one cannot get away from a jukebox theory of meaning, the doctrine that no message contains inherent meaning. Because before any message can be understood, it has to be used as the input to some jukebox, which means that information contained in the jukebox must be added to the message before it acquires meaning. This argument is very similar to the trap which the tortoise caught Achilles in Lewis Carroll's dialogue. There, the trap was the idea that before you can use any rule, you have to have a rule which tells you how to use that rule. In other words, there is an infinite hierarchy of levels of rules, which prevents any rule from ever getting used. Here, the trap is the idea that before you can understand any message, you have to have a message which tells you how to understand that message. In other words, there is an infinite hierarchy of levels of messages, which prevents any message from ever getting understood. However, we all know that these paradoxes are invalid, for rules do get used and messages do get understood. How come? Against the jukebox theory. This happens because our intelligence is not disembodied, but is instantiated in physical objects, our brains. Their structure is due to the long process of evolution, and their operations are governed by the laws of physics. Since they are physical entities, our brains run without being told how to run. So it is at the level where thoughts are produced by physical law that Carroll's rule paradox breaks down. And likewise, it is at the level where a brain interprets the incoming data as a message that the message paradox breaks down. It seems that brains come equipped with hardware for recognizing that certain things are messages, and for decoding those messages. This minimal inborn ability to extract inner meaning is what allows the highly recursive snowballing process of language acquisition to take place. The inborn hardware is like a jukebox. It supplies the additional information, which turns mere triggers into complete messages. Meaning is intrinsic if intelligence is natural. Now, if different people's jukeboxes had different songs in them, and responded to given triggers in completely idiosyncratic ways, then we would have no inclination to attribute intrinsic meaning to those triggers. However, human brains are so constructed that one brain responds in much the same way to a given trigger as does another brain, all other things being equal. This is why a baby can learn any language. It responds to triggers in the same way as any other baby. This uniformity of human jukeboxes establishes a uniform language in which frame messages and outer messages can be communicated. If, furthermore, we believe that human intelligence is just one example of a general phenomenon in nature, the emergence of intelligent beings in widely varying contexts, then presumably the language in which frame messages and outer messages are communicated among humans is a dialect of a universal language by which intelligences can communicate with each other. Thus, there would be certain kinds of triggers which would have universal triggering power, in that all intelligent beings would tend to respond to them in the same way as we do. This would allow us to shift our description of where meaning is located. We could ascribe the meanings, frame, outer, and inner, of a message to the message itself because of the fact that deciphering mechanisms are themselves universal. That is, they are fundamental forms of nature which arise in the same way in diverse contexts. To make it very concrete, suppose that A5 triggered the same song in all jukeboxes, and suppose moreover that jukeboxes were not man-made artifacts but widely occurring natural objects like galaxies or carbon atoms. Under such circumstances, we would probably feel justified in calling the universal triggering power of A5 its inherent meaning. Also, A5 would merit the name of message rather than trigger, and the song would indeed be a revelation of the inherent, though implicit, meaning of A5. Earth chauvinism. This ascribing of meaning to a message comes from the invariance of the processing of the message by intelligences distributed anywhere in the universe. In that sense, it bears some resemblance to the ascribing of mass to an object. To the ancients, it must have seemed that an object's weight was an intrinsic property of the object. But as gravity became understood, it was realized that weight varies with the gravitational field the object is immersed in. Nevertheless, there is a related quantity, the mass, which does not vary according to the gravitational field. And from this invariance came the conclusion that an object's mass was an intrinsic property of the object itself. If it turns out that mass is also variable according to the context, then we will backtrack and revise our opinion that it is an intrinsic property of an object. In the same way, we might imagine that there could exist other kinds of jukeboxes, intelligences, which communicate among each other via messages which we would never recognize as messages, and who also would never recognize our messages as messages. If that were the case, then the claim that meaning is an intrinsic property of a set of symbols would have to be reconsidered. On the other hand, how could we ever realize that such beings existed? It is interesting to compare this argument for the inherency of meaning with the parallel argument for the inherency of weight. Suppose one defined an object's weight as the magnitude of the downward force which the object exerts when on the surface of the planet Earth. Under this definition, the downward force which an object exerts when on the surface of Mars would have to be given another name than weight. This definition makes weight an inherent property, but at the cost of geocentricity, Earth chauvinism. It would be like Greenwich chauvinism, refusing to accept local time anywhere on the globe, but in the GMT time zone. It is an unnatural way to think about time. Perhaps we are unknowingly burdened with a similar chauvinism with respect to our intelligence, and intelligence in general, and consequently with respect to meaning. In our chauvinism, we would call any being with a brain sufficiently much like our own intelligent, and refuse to recognize other types of objects as intelligent. To take an extreme example, consider a meteorite, which instead of deciphering the outer space Bach record, punctures it with colossal indifference, and continues in its merry orbit. It has interacted with the record in a way which we feel disregards the record's meaning. Therefore, we might well feel tempted to call the meteorite stupid, but perhaps we would thereby do the meteorite a disservice. Perhaps it has a higher intelligence, which we in our earth chauvinism cannot perceive, and its interaction with the record was a manifestation of that higher intelligence. Perhaps then, the record has a higher meaning, totally different from that which we attribute to it. Perhaps its meaning depends on the type of intelligence perceiving it. Perhaps. It would be nice if we could define intelligence in some other way than that which gets the same meaning out of a sequence of symbols as we do. For if we can only define it in this one way, then our argument that meaning is an intrinsic property is circular, hence content-free. We should try to formulate in some independent way a set of characteristics which deserve the name intelligence. Such characteristics would constitute the uniform core of intelligence shared by humans. At this point in history, we do not yet have a well-defined list of those characteristics. However, it appears likely that within the next few decades there will be much progress made in elucidating what human intelligence is. In particular, perhaps cognitive psychologists, workers in artificial intelligence, and neuroscientists will be able to synthesize their understandings and come up with a definition of intelligence. It may still be human chauvinistic. There is no way around that. But to counterbalance that, there may be some elegant and beautiful, and perhaps even simple, abstract ways of characterizing the essence of intelligence. This would serve to lessen the feeling of having formulated an anthropocentric concept. And of course, if contact were established with an alien civilization from another star system, we would feel supported in our belief that our own type of intelligence is not just a fluke, but an example of a basic form which reappears in nature in diverse contexts, like stars in uranium nuclei. This in turn would support the idea of meaning being an inherent property. To conclude this topic, let us consider some new and old examples and discuss the degree of inherent meaning which they have, by putting ourselves, to the extent that we can, in the shoes of an alien civilization which intercepts a weird object. Two plaques in space. Consider a rectangular plaque made of an indestructible metallic alloy, on which are engraved two dots, one immediately above the other. The preceding colon shows a picture. Though the overall form of the object might suggest that it is an artifact, and therefore that it might conceal some message, two dots are simply not sufficient to convey anything. Can you, before reading on, hypothesize what they are supposed to mean? But suppose that we made a second plaque, containing more dots, as follows. Now, one of the most obvious things to do, so it might seem to a terrestrial intelligence at least, would be to count the dots in the successive rows. The sequence obtained is 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. Here there is evidence of a rule governing the progression from one line to the next. In fact, the recursive part of the definition of the Fibonacci numbers can be inferred, with some confidence, from this list. Suppose we think of the initial pair of values 1, 1 as a genotype from which the phenotype, the full Fibonacci sequence, is pulled out by a recursive rule. By sending the genotype alone, namely the first version of the plaque, we fail to send the information that allows reconstitution of the phenotype. Thus, the genotype does not contain the full specification of the phenotype. On the other hand, if we consider the second version of the plaque to be the genotype, then there is much better cause to suppose that the phenotype could actually be reconstituted. This new version of the genotype, a long genotype, contains so much information that the mechanism by which phenotype is pulled out of genotype can be inferred by intelligence from the genotype alone. Once this mechanism is firmly established as the way to pull phenotype from genotype, then we can go back to using short genotypes like the first plaque. For instance, the short genotype 1, 3 would yield the phenotype 1, 3, 4, 7, 11, 18, 29, 47, the Lucas sequence. And for every set of two initial values, that is, for every short genotype, there will be a corresponding phenotype. But the short genotypes, unlike the long ones, are only triggers, buttons to be pushed on the jukeboxes into which the recursive rule has been built. The long genotypes are informative enough that they trigger in an intelligent being the recognition of what kind of jukebox to build. In that sense, the long genotypes contain the information of the phenotype, whereas the short genotypes do not. In other words, The long genotype transmits not only an inner message, but also an outer message, which enables the inner message to be read. It seems that the clarity of the outer message resides in the sheer length of the message. This is not unexpected. It parallels precisely what happens in deciphering ancient texts. Clearly, one's likelihood of success depends crucially on the amount of text available. Bach versus Cage again. But just having a long text may not be enough. Let us take up once more the difference between sending a record of Bach's music into space and a record of John Cage's music. Incidentally, the latter, being a composition of aleatorically generated elements, might be handily called a cage, whereas the former, being a beautiful aperiodic crystal of harmony, might aptly be dubbed a Bach. Now, let's consider what the meaning of a cage piece is to ourselves. A cage piece has to be taken in a large cultural setting, as a revolt against certain kinds of traditions. Thus, if we want to transmit that meaning, we must not only send the notes of the piece, but we must have earlier communicated an extensive history of Western culture. It is fair to say, then, that an isolated record of John Cage's music does not have an intrinsic meaning. However, for a listener who is sufficiently well versed in Western and Eastern cultures, particularly in the trends in Western music over the last few decades, it does carry meaning. But such a listener is like a jukebox, and the piece is like a pair of buttons. The meaning is mostly contained inside the listener to begin with. The music serves only to trigger it, and this jukebox, unlike pure intelligence, is not at all universal. It is highly earthbound. Depending on idiosyncratic sequences of events all over our globe for long periods of time. Hoping that John Cage's music will be understood by another civilization is like hoping that your favorite tune on a jukebox on the moon will have the same code buttons as in a saloon in Saskatoon. On the other hand, to appreciate Bach requires far less cultural knowledge. This may seem like high irony, for Bach is so much more complex and organized, and Cage is so devoid of intellectuality. But there is a strange reversal here. Intelligence loves patterns and balks at randomness. For most people, the randomness in Cage's music requires much explanation, and even after explanations, they may feel they are missing the message. Whereas, with much of Bach, words are superfluous. In that sense, Bach's music is more self-contained than Cage's music. Still, it is not clear how much of the human condition is presumed by Bach. For instance, music has three major dimensions of structure: melody, harmony, rhythm, each of which can be further divided into small-scale, intermediate, and overall aspects. Now, in each of these dimensions, there is a certain amount of complexity which our minds can handle before boggling. Clearly, a composer takes this into account, most unconsciously, when writing a piece. These levels of tolerable complexity along different dimensions are probably very dependent on the peculiar conditions of our evolution as a species, and another intelligent species might have developed music with totally different levels of tolerable complexity along these many dimensions. Thus, a Bach piece might conceivably have to be accompanied by a lot of information about the human species, which simply could not be inferred from the music structure alone. If we equate the Bach music with the genotype and the emotions which it is supposed to evoke with the phenotype, then what we are interested in is whether the genotype contains all the information necessary for the revelation of the phenotype. How universal is DNA's message? The general question we are facing, and which is very similar to the questions inspired by the two plaques, is this: how much of the context necessary for its own understanding is a message capable of restoring? We can now revert to the original biological meanings of genotype and phenotype, DNA, and a living organism, and ask similar questions. Does DNA have universal triggering power, or does it need a bio-jukebox to reveal its meaning? Can DNA evoke a phenotype without being embedded in the proper chemical context? To this question, the answer is no, but a qualified no. Certainly, a molecule of DNA in a vacuum will not create anything at all. However, if a molecule of DNA were sent out to seek its fortune in the universe, as we imagined the Bach and the Cage were, it might be intercepted by an intelligent civilization. They might first of all recognize its frame message. Given that, they might go on to try to deduce from its chemical structure what kind of chemical environment it seemed to want, and then supply such an environment. Successively, more refined attempts along these lines might eventually lead to a full restoration of the chemical context necessary for the revelation of DNA's phenotypical meaning. This may sound a little implausible, but if one allows many millions of years for the experiment, perhaps the DNA's meaning would finally emerge. On the other hand, if the sequence of bases which compose a strand of DNA were sent as abstract symbols, as in figure 41, not as a long helical molecule, the odds are virtually nil that this as an outer message would trigger the property coding mechanism which would enable the phenotype to be drawn out of the genotype. This would be a case of wrapping an inner message in such an abstract outer message that the context restoring power of the outer message would be lost. And so, in a very pragmatic sense, the set of symbols would have no intrinsic meaning. Lest you think this all sounds hopelessly abstract and philosophical, consider that the exact moment when phenotype can be said to be available or implied by genotype is a highly charged issue in our day. It is the issue of abortion. Figure 41. This giant aperiodic crystal is the base sequence for the chromosome of bacteriophage, what is that? What letter is that? Whatever. X174. It is the first complete genotype ever mapped out for any organism. About 2,000 of these Brustophodonic pages would be needed to show the base sequence of a single E. coli cell, and about 1 million pages to show the base sequence of the DNA of a single human cell. The book now in your hands contains roughly the same amount of information as a molecular blueprint for one measly E. coli cell. Chromatic fantasy and feud. Having had a splendid dip in the pond, the tortoise is just crawling out and shaking himself dry when who but Achilles walks by. "Ho there, Achilles. I was just thinking of you as I splashed around in the pond." "Isn't that curious? I was just thinking of you too, while I meandered through the meadows. They're so green at this time of year." "You think so? It reminds me of a thought I was hoping to share with you. Would you like to hear it?" "Oh, I would be delighted. That is, I would be delighted as long as you're not going to try to snare me in one of your wicked traps of logic, Mr. T." "Wicked traps? Oh, you do me wrong. Would I do anything wicked? I am a peaceful soul, bothering nobody and leading a gentle, herbivorous life, and my thoughts merely drift among the oddities and quirks of how things are, as I see them. I, humble observer of phenomena, plod along and puff my silly words into the air, rather unspectacularly, I am afraid. But to reassure you about my intentions, I was only planning to speak of my tortoiseshell today, and as you know, those things have nothing whatsoever to do with logic." "Your words do reassure me, Mr. T, and in fact my curiosity is quite piqued. I would certainly like to listen to what you have to say, even if it is unspectacular. Let's see, how shall I begin? What strikes you most about my shell, Achilles?" "It looks wonderfully clean." "Thank you. I just went swimming and washed off several layers of dirt which had accumulated last century. Now you can see how green my shell is." "Such a good healthy green shell. It's nice to see it shining in the sun." "Green? It's not green." "Well, didn't you just tell me your shell was green?" "I did." "Then we agree it is green." "No, it isn't green." "Oh, I understand your game. You're hinting to me that what you say isn't necessarily true, that tortoises play with language, that your statements and reality don't necessarily match." "That to entrap a poor, innocent, bumbling tortoise in a fatal..." Wait, am I on the right? No. "I am certainly not. Tortoises treat words as sacred. Tortoises revere accuracy." "Well then, why did you say that your shell is green, and that it is not green also?" "I never said such a thing, but I wish I had." "You would have liked to say that?" "Not a bit. I regret saying it, and I disagree wholeheartedly with it." "That certainly contradicts what you said before." "Contradicts? Contradicts? I never contradict myself. It's not part of tortoise nature." "Well, I've caught you this time, you slippery fellow, you. Caught you in a full-fledged contradiction." "Yes, I guess you did. There you go again. Now you're contradicting yourself more and more. You're so steeped in contradiction it's impossible to argue with you. Not really. I argue with myself without any trouble at all. Perhaps the problem is with you. I would venture a guess that maybe you're the one who's contradictory, but you're so trapped in your own tangled web that you can't see how inconsistent you're being. What an insulting suggestion. I'm going to show you that you're the contradictory one, and there are no two ways about it. Well, if it is so, your task ought to be cut out for you. What could be easier than to point out a contradiction? Go ahead, try it out. Now I hardly know where to begin. Oh, I know. You first said that 1, your shell is green. And then you went on to say that 2, your shell is not green. What more can I say? Just kindly point out the contradiction. Quit beating around the bush. But, oh, now I begin to see. Sometimes I am so slow-witted. It must be that you and I differ as to what constitutes a contradiction. That's the trouble. Well, let me make myself very clear. A contradiction occurs when somebody says one thing and denies it at the same time. A neat trick. I'd like to see it done. Probably ventriloquists would excel at contradictions, speaking out of both sides of their mouth, as it were, but I'm not a ventriloquist. Well, what I actually meant is just that somebody can say one thing and deny it all within one single sentence. It doesn't literally have to be in the same instant. Well, you didn't give one sentence, you gave 2. Yes, 2 sentences that contradict each other. I am sad to see the tangled structure of your thoughts becoming so exposed, Achilles. First you told me that a contradiction is something which occurs in a single sentence. Then you told me that you found a contradiction in a pair of sentences I uttered. Frankly, it's just as I said. Your own system of thought is so delusional that you manage to avoid seeing how inconsistent it is. From the outside, however, it's plain as day. Sometimes I get so confused by your diversionary tactics that I can't quite tell if we're arguing about something utterly petty or something deep and profound. I assure you, tortoises don't spend their time on the petty, hence it is the latter. I am very reassured, thank you. Now I have had a moment to reflect, and I see the necessary logical step to convince you that you contradicted yourself. Good, good. I hope it's an easy step, an indisputable one. It certainly is. Even you will agree with it. The idea is that you believed sentence 1, my shell is green, and you believed sentence 2, my shell is not green. You would believe one compound sentence in which both were combined, wouldn't you? Of course. It would only be reasonable, providing just that the manner of combination is universally acceptable. But I'm sure that we'll agree on that. Yes, and then I'll have you. The combination I propose is, but we must be careful in combining sentences. For instance, you'd grant that politicians lie is true, wouldn't you? Who could deny it? Good. Likewise, cast iron sinks is a valid utterance, isn't it? Indubitably. Then, putting them together, we get politicians lie and cast iron sinks. Now, that's not the case, is it? Now, wait a minute. Politicians lie and cast iron sinks? Well, no, but... So you see, combining 2 true sentences in one is not a safe policy, is it? But you combine the 2 in such a silly way. Silly? What have you got to object to in the way I combine them? Would you have me do otherwise? You should have used the word and, not in. I should have. You mean if you'd had your way, I should have. No, it's the logical thing to do. It's got nothing to do with me personally. This is where you always lose me, when you resort to your logic and its high-sounding principles. None of that for me today, please. Oh, Mr. Tortoise, don't put me through all this agony. You know very well that that's what and means. It's harmless to combine 2 sentences with and. Harmless, my eye, what gall! This is certainly a pernicious plot to entrap a poor, innocent, bumbling tortoise in a fatal contradiction. If it were so harmless, why would you be trying so bloody hard to get me to do it, eh? You've left me speechless. You make me feel like a villain where I really had only the most innocent of... You make me feel like a villain where I really had only the most innocent of motivations. That's what everyone believes of himself. Shame on me, trying to outwit you, to use words to snare you in a self-contradiction. I feel so rotten. And well you should. I know what you were trying to set up. Your plan was to make me accept sentence 3, to wit, my shell is green and my shell is not green, and such a blatant falsehood is repellent to the tongue of a tortoise. Oh, I'm so sorry I started all this. You needn't be sorry, my feelings aren't hurt. After all, I'm used to the unreasonable ways of the folk about me. I enjoy your company, Achilles, even if your thinking lacks clarity. Yes, I fear I am set in my ways, and will probably continue to err and err again in my quest for truth. Today's exchange may have served a little to right your course. Good day, Achilles. Good day, Mr. T. Chapter 7, the Propositional Calculus. Words and Symbols. The preceding dialogue is reminiscent of the two-part invention by Lewis Carroll. In both, the tortoise refuses to... In both, the tortoise refuses to use normal, ordinary words in the normal, ordinary way. Or at least he refuses to do so when it is not to his advantage to do so. A way to think about the Carroll paradox was given last chapter. In this chapter, we are going to make symbols do what Achilles couldn't make the tortoise do with his words. That is, we are going to make a formal system, one of whose symbols will do just what Achilles wished the word and would do when spoken by the tortoise, and another of whose symbols will behave the way the words if, then ought to be behaved. There are only two other words which we will attempt to deal with, or and not. Reasoning, which depends only on correct usage of these four words, is termed propositional reasoning. Alphabet and first rule of the propositional calculus. I will present this new formal system called the propositional calculus, a little like a puzzle, not explaining everything at once, but letting you figure things out to some extent. We begin with the first list of symbols. Left arrow, right arrow, P, Q, R, what's it called? Grave, up arrow, down arrow, hoop, I guess. I don't know what that's called. Oh boy. Tilde, square bracket left and square bracket right. Jeez. The first rule of this system that I will reveal is the following. Rule of joining. If x and y are theorems of the system, then so is the string left arrow x, up arrow y, right arrow. This rule takes two theorems and combines them into one. It should remind you of the dialogue. Well-formed strings. There will be several other rules of inference, and they will all be presented shortly, but first it is important to define a subset of all strings, namely the well-formed strings. They will be defined in a recursive way. We begin with the atoms. P, Q, and R are called atoms. New atoms are formed by appending primes onto the right of old atoms, thus R prime, Q prime prime, P prime prime prime, etc. This gives an endless supply of atoms. All atoms are well formed. Then we have four recursive formation rules. If x and y are well formed, then the following four strings are also well formed. 1 tilde x, 2 left arrow x, up arrow y, right arrow, 3 left arrow x, down arrow y, right arrow, 4 left arrow x, hoop y, right arrow. For example, all of the following are well formed. P, atom, tilde P by 1, tilde tilde P by 1, Q prime atom, tilde Q prime by 1, left arrow P, up arrow, tilde Q prime, right arrow by 2, tilde left arrow P, up arrow, tilde Q prime, right arrow by 1, left arrow tilde tilde prime, hoop Q prime, right arrow by 4, left arrow tilde left arrow P, up tilde Q prime, down arrow left arrow tilde tilde prime, P hoop Q prime, right arrow by 3. I'm not going to read all those. The last one may look quite formidable, but it is built up straightforwardly from two components, namely the two lines just above it. Each of them is in turn built up from previous lines, and so on. Every well-formed string can in this way be traced back to its elementary constituents, that is, atoms. You simply run the formation rules backwards until you can no more. This process is guaranteed to terminate, since each formation rule, when run forwards, is a lengthening rule, so that running it backwards always drives you towards atoms. This method of decomposing strings thus serves as a check on the well-formedness of any string. It is a top-down decision procedure for well-formedness. You can test your understanding of this decision procedure by checking which of the following strings are well-formed. Answer: those whose numbers are Fibonacci numbers are not well-formed. The rest are well-formed. More rules of inference. Now we come to the rest of the rules by which theorems of this system are constructed. A few rules of inference will follow. In all of them, the symbols x and y are always to be understood as restricted to well-formed strings. Rule of separation. If left arrow x, up arrow y, right arrow is a theorem, then both x and y are theorems. Incidentally, you should have a pretty good guess by now as to what concept the symbol up arrow stands for. Hint, it is the troublesome word from the preceding dialogue. And? From the following rule, you should be able to figure out what concept the tilde represents. Double tilde rule. The string tilde tilde can be deleted from any theorem. It can also be inserted into any theorem, provided that the resulting string is itself well-formed. The fantasy rule. Now, a special feature of this system is that it has no axioms, only rules. If you think back to the previous formal systems we've seen, you may wonder how there can be any theorems then. How does everything get started? The answer is that there's one rule which manufactures theorems from out of thin air. It doesn't need an old theorem as input. The rest of the rules do require input. This special rule is called the fantasy rule. The reason I call it that is quite simple. To use the fantasy rule, the first thing you do is to write down any well-formed string x you like, and then fantasize by asking, what if the string x were an axiom or a theorem? And then you let the system itself give an answer. That is, you go ahead and make a derivation with x as the opening line. Let us suppose y is the last line. Of course, the derivation must strictly follow the rules of the system. Everything from x to y inclusive is the fantasy. X is the premise of the fantasy, and y is its outcome. The next step is to jump out of the fantasy, having learned from it that if x were a theorem, y would be a theorem. Still, you might wonder, where is the real theorem? The real theorem is the string left arrow x, hoop y, right arrow. Notice the resemblance of this string to the sentence printed above. To signal the entry into and emergence from a fantasy, one uses the square brackets, left square bracket and right square bracket respectively. Thus, whenever you see a left square bracket, you know you are pushing into a fantasy, and the next line will contain the fantasy's premise. Whenever you see a right square bracket, you know you are popping back out, and the preceding line was the outcome. It is helpful, though not necessary, to indent those lines of a derivation which take place in fantasies. Here is an illustration of the fantasy rule, in which the string p is taken as a premise. It so happens that p is not a theorem, but that is of no import. We are merely inquiring, what if it were? we make the following fantasy. Left bracket, push into fantasy. P, premise. Tilde tilde P, outcome by double tilde rule. Right bracket, pop out of fantasy. The fantasy shows that if P were a theorem, so would tilde tilde P be one. We now squeeze this sentence out of English, the meta language, into the formal notation, the object language. Left arrow P, hoop, tilde tilde P, right arrow. This, our first theorem of the propositional calculus, should reveal to you the intended interpretation of the symbol hoop. Here is another derivation using the fantasy rule. Left bracket, push, left arrow P, up arrow Q, right arrow, premise. P, separation, Q, separation. Left arrow Q, up arrow P, right arrow, joining. Right square bracket, pop. Left arrow P, up arrow Q, right arrow, hoop. Left arrow Q, up arrow P, right arrow, fantasy rule. It is important to understand that only the last line is a genuine theorem. Here, everything else is in the fantasy. Recursion in the fantasy rule. As you might guess from the recursion terminology push and pop, the fantasy rule can be used recursively. Thus, there can be fantasies within fantasies, thrice nested fantasies, and so on. This means that there are all sorts of levels of reality, just as in nested stories or movies. When you pop out of a movie within a movie, you feel for a moment as if you had reached the real world, though you are still one level away from the top. Similarly, when you pop out of a fantasy within a fantasy, you are in a realer world than you had been, but you are still one level away from the top. Now, a no smoking sign inside a movie theater does not apply to the characters in the movie. There is no carryover from the real world into the fantasy world in movies. But in the propositional calculus, there is a carryover from the real world into the fantasies. There is even carryover from a fantasy to fantasies inside it. This is formalized by the following rule. Carryover rule. Inside a fantasy, any theorem from the reality one level higher can be brought in and used. It is as if a no smoking sign in a theater applied not only to all the moviegoers, but also to all the actors in the movie, and by repetition of the same idea to anyone inside multiply nested movies. Warning, there is no carryover in the reverse direction. Theorems inside fantasies cannot be exported to the exterior. If it weren't for this fact, you could write anything as the first line of a fantasy, and then lift it out into the real world as a theorem. To show how carryover works, and to show how the fantasy rule can be used recursively, we present the following derivation. Left bracket, well, I'll just read the push, premise of outer fantasy, push again, premise of inner fantasy, carryover of P into inner fantasy, joining, pop out of inner fantasy, regain outer fantasy, fantasy rule, pop out of outer fantasy, reach real world, fantasy rule. Note that I've indented the outer fantasy once and the inner fantasy twice to emphasize the nature of these nested levels of reality. One way to look at the fantasy rule is to say that an observation made about the system is inserted into the system. Namely, the theorem left arrow x hoop y right arrow, which gets produced, can be thought of as a representation inside the system of the statement about the system. If x is a theorem, then y is too. To be more specific, the intended interpretation for left arrow P, hoop Q, right arrow is if P then Q, or equivalently, P implies Q. The converse of the fantasy rule. Now, Lewis Carroll's dialogue was all about if-then statements. In particular, Achilles had a lot of trouble in persuading the tortoise to accept the second clause of an if-then statement, even when the if-then statement itself was accepted, as well as its first clause. The next rule allows you to infer the second clause of a hoop string, provided that the hoop string itself is a theorem, or the then string, and that its first clause is also a theorem. Rule of detachment. If x and left arrow x, hoop y, right arrow are both theorems, then y is a theorem. Incidentally, this rule is often called modus ponens, and the fantasy rule is often called the deduction theorem. The intended interpretation of the symbols. We might as well let the cat out of the bag at this point and reveal the meanings of the rest of the symbols of our new system. In case it is not yet apparent, the symbol up arrow is meant to be acting isomorphically to the normal, everyday word and. The symbol tilde represents the word not. It is a formal sort of negation. The angle brackets left arrow and right arrow, or the angle brackets left and right, are groupers, their function being very similar to that of parentheses in ordinary algebra. The main difference is that in algebra, you have the freedom to insert parentheses or to leave them out, according to taste and style, whereas in a formal system, such anarchic freedom is not tolerated. The symbol down arrow represents the word or, vel. Is that what it's called, a vel? I don't know. Vel is a Latin word for or. No, it's not called vel. It's just, I guess that's why it used to be. Anyway, the or that is meant is the so-called inclusive or, which means that the interpretation of left angle bracket x, what, up angle bracket, y, right arrow, right angle bracket, gosh, is either x or y or both. Either x or y or both. The only symbols we have not interpreted are the atoms. An atom has no single interpretation. It may be interpreted by any sentence of English. It must continue to be interpreted by the same sentence if it occurs multiply within a string or derivation. Thus, for example, the well-formed string left angle bracket p wait, were there two of them? Yeah, I guess there were. Anyway, down angle bracket tilde p, right angle bracket, or this up, oh my gosh, left angle bracket p, up angle bracket tilde p, right angle bracket, could be interpreted by the compound sentence, this mind is Buddha and this mind is not Buddha. Now let us look at each of the theorems so far derived and interpret them. The first one was left angle bracket p hoop tilde p right angle bracket. If we keep the same interpretation for p, we have the following interpretation. If this mind is Buddha, then it is not the case that this mind is not Buddha. Note how I rendered the double negation. It is awkward to repeat a negation in any natural language, so one gets around it by using two different ways of expressing negation. The second theorem we derived was left angle bracket p, up angle bracket q, right angle bracket hoop, left angle bracket q, upper angle bracket p, right angle bracket, right angle bracket. If we let q be interpreted by the sentence, this flax weighs 3 pounds, then our theorem reads as follows. If this mind is Buddha and this flax weighs 3 pounds, then this flax weighs 3 pounds and this mind is Buddha. The third theorem was left angle bracket p, hoop, left angle bracket q. What is hoop? I don't know what it's called. Hoop, left angle bracket p, up angle bracket q, right angle bracket, right angle bracket, right angle bracket. This one goes into the following nested if-then sentence. If this mind is Buddha, then if this flax weighs 3 pounds, then this mind is Buddha and this flax weighs 3 pounds. You probably have noticed that each theorem, when interpreted, says something absolutely trivial and self-evident. Sometimes they are so self-evident that they sound vacuous and, paradoxically enough, confusing or even wrong. This may not be very impressive, but just remember that there are plenty of falsities out there which could have been produced. yet they weren't. This system, the propositional calculus, steps neatly from truth to truth, carefully avoiding all falsities, just as a person who is concerned with staying dry will step carefully from one stepping stone in a creek to the next, following the layout of stepping stones no matter how twisted and tricky it might be. What is impressive is that in the propositional calculus, the whole thing is done purely typographically. There is nobody down in there thinking about the meaning of the strings. It is all done mechanically, thoughtlessly, rigidly, even stupidly. Rounding out the list of rules. We have not yet stated all of the rules of the propositional calculus. The complete set of rules is listed below, including the 3 new ones. Joining rule. If x and y are theorems, then left angle bracket x, upper angle bracket y, right angle bracket is a theorem. Separation rule. If left angle bracket x, upper angle bracket y, right angle bracket is a theorem, then both x and y are theorems. Double tilde rule. The string tilde tilde can be deleted from any theorem. It can also be inserted into any theorem, provided that the resulting string is itself well-formed. Fantasy rule. If y can be derived when x is assumed to be a theorem, then left angle bracket x hoop y right angle bracket is a theorem. Carryover rule. Inside a fantasy, any theorem from the reality one level higher can be brought in and used. Rule of detachment. If x and left angle bracket x hoop y right angle bracket are both theorems, then y is a theorem. Contrapositive rule. Left angle bracket x hoop y right angle bracket and left angle bracket tilde y hoop tilde x right angle bracket are interchangeable. De Morgan's rule. Left angle bracket tilde x up angle bracket tilde y right angle bracket and tilde left angle bracket x down angle bracket y right angle bracket are interchangeable. Switcheroo rule. Left angle bracket x down angle bracket y right angle bracket and left angle bracket tilde x hoop y right angle bracket are interchangeable. The switcheroo rule is named after Q. Switcheroo, an Albanian railroad engineer who worked in logic on the siding. By interchangeable in the foregoing rules, the following is meant. If an expression of one form occurs as either a theorem or part of a theorem, the other form may be substituted, and the resulting string will also be a theorem. It must be kept in mind that the symbols x and y always stand for well-formed strings of the system. Justifying the rules. Before we see these rules used inside derivations, let's look at some very short justifications for them. Wait, am I on the wrong? My bad. Forgot to move a page. You can probably justify them to yourself better than my examples, which is why I only give a couple. The contrapositive rule expresses explicitly a way of turning around conditional statements which we carry out unconsciously. For instance, the sentence. If you are studying it, then you are far from the way. If you are studying it, then you are far from the way means the same thing as if you are close to the way, then you are not studying it. De Morgan's rule can be illustrated by our familiar sentence, the flag is not moving and the wind is not moving. If P symbolizes the flag is moving and Q symbolizes the wind is moving, then the compound sentence is symbolized by left angle bracket tilde P up angle bracket tilde Q right angle bracket, which according to De Morgan's law is interchangeable with tilde left angle bracket P down angle bracket Q right angle bracket, whose interpretation would be, it is not true that either the flag or the wind is moving, and no one could deny it that is a sensible conclusion to draw. For the switcheroo rule, consider the sentence, either a cloud is hanging over the mountain, or the moonlight is penetrating the waves of the lake, which might be spoken, I suppose, by a wistful Zen master remembering a familiar lake which he can visualize mentally but cannot see. Now hang on to your seat, for the switcheroo rule tells us that this is interchangeable with the thought, if a cloud is not hanging over the mountain, then the moonlight is penetrating the waves of the lake. This may not be enlightenment, but it is the best the propositional calculus has to offer. Playing around with the system. Now let us apply these rules to a previous theorem and see what we get. For instance, take the theorem left angle bracket p hoop tilde tilde p right angle bracket colon. No, sorry, the colon is not part of it. Left angle bracket p hoop tilde tilde p right angle bracket old theorem. Left angle bracket tilde 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 p hoop tilde p right angle bracket contrapositive. Left angle bracket tilde p hoop tilde p right angle bracket double tilde. Left angle bracket p down angle bracket tilde p right angle bracket switcheroo. This new theorem, when interpreted, says either this mind is Buddha or this mind is not Buddha. Once again, the interpreted theorem, though perhaps less than mind-boggling, is at least true. Semi-interpretations. It is natural when one reads theorems of the propositional calculus out loud to interpret everything but the atoms. I call this semi-interpreting. For instance, the semi-interpretation of left angle bracket p down angle bracket tilde p right angle bracket would be P or not P. Despite the fact that P is not a sentence, the above semi-sentence still sounds true, because you can very easily imagine sticking any sentence in for P, and the form of the semi-interpreted theorem assures you that however you make your choice, the resulting sentence will be true. And that is the key idea of the propositional calculus. It produces theorems which, when semi-interpreted, are seen to be universally true semi-sentences, by which is meant that no matter how you complete the interpretation, the final result will be a true statement. Ganto's axe. Now we can do a more advanced exercise, based on a Zen koan called Ganto's axe. Here is how it begins. One day, Tokusan told his student Ganto, "I have 2 monks who have been here for many years. Go and examine them." Ganto picked up an axe and went to the hut where the 2 monks were meditating. He raised the axe, saying, "If you say a word, I will cut off your heads, and if you do not say a word, I will also cut off your heads. If you say a word, I will cut off this koan. If you do not say a word, I will also cut off this koan." Because I want to translate some of it into our notation, let us symbolize "you say a word" by P, and "I will cut off your heads" by Q. And then Ganto's axe threat is symbolized by the string left angle bracket, P hoop Q, right angle bracket, up angle bracket, left angle bracket, tilde P hoop Q, right angle bracket, right angle bracket. What if this axe threat were an axiom? Here is a fantasy to answer that question. Push, Ganto's axiom, separation, contrapositive, separation, contrapositive, push again, premise. Carryover of line 4, detachment, carryover of line 6, detachment, lines 8 and 11, joining, De Morgan, pop once, fantasy rule, contrapositive, push, premise, also outcome, pop, fantasy rule, switcheroo, detachment, lines 22 and 17, pop out. The power of the propositional calculus is shown in this example. Why, in but 24 steps, we have deduced Q, that the heads will be cut off. Ominously, the rule last invoked was detachment. It might seem superfluous to continue the koan now, since we know what must ensue. However, I shall drop my resolve to cut the koan off. It is a true Zen koan, after all. The rest of the incident is here related. Both monks continued their meditation as if he had not spoken. Ganto dropped the axe and said, "You are true Zen students." He returned to Tokusan and related the incident. "I see your side well," Tokusan agreed. "But tell me, how is their side?" "Tozan may admit them," replied Ganto, "but they should not be admitted under Tokusan." Do you see my side well? How is the Zen side?" Is there a decision procedure for theorems? The propositional calculus gives us a set of rules for producing statements which would be true in all conceivable worlds. That is why all of its theorems sound so simple-minded. It seems that they have absolutely no content. Looked at this way, the propositional calculus might seem to be a waste of time, since what it tells us is absolutely trivial. On the other hand, it does it by specifying the form of statements that are universally true, and this throws a new kind of light onto the core truths of the universe. They are not only fundamental, but also regular. They can be produced by one set of typographical rules. To put it another way, they are all cut from the same cloth. You might consider whether the same could be said about Zen koans. Could they all be produced by one set of typographical rules? It is quite relevant here to bring up the question of a decision procedure. That is, does there exist any mechanical method to tell non-theorems from theorems? If so, that would tell us that the set of theorems of the propositional calculus is not only RE, but also recursive. It turns out that there is an interesting decision procedure, the method of truth tables. It would take us a bit afield to present it here. You can find it in almost any standard book on logic. And what about Zen koans? There could conceivably be a mechanical decision procedure which distinguishes genuine Zen koans from other things. Do we know the system is consistent? Up till now, we have only presumed that all theorems, when interpreted as indicated, are true statements. But do we know that is the case? Could we prove it to be? This is just another way of asking whether the intended interpretations and for up angle bracket, etc., merit being called the passive meanings of the symbols. One can look at this issue from two very different points of view, which might be called the prudent and imprudent points of view. I will now present these two sides as I see them, personifying their holders as prudence and imprudence. Prudence. We will only know that all theorems come out true under the intended interpretation if we manage to prove it. That is the cautious, thoughtful way to proceed. Imprudence. On the contrary, it is obvious that all theorems will come out true. If you doubt me, look again at the rules of the system. You will find that each rule makes a symbol act exactly as the word it represents ought to be used. For instance, the joining rule makes the symbol up angle bracket act as and ought to act. The rule of detachment makes hoop act as it ought to, if it is to stand for implies or if then, and so on. Unless you are like the tortoise, you will recognize in each rule a codification of a pattern you use in your own thought. So if you trust your own thought patterns, then you have to believe that all theorems come out true. That's the way I see it. I don't need any further proof. If you think that some theorem comes out false, then presumably you think that some rule must be wrong. Show me which one. Prudence. I'm not sure that there is any faulty rule, so I can't point one out to you. Still, I can imagine the following kind of scenario. You, following the rules, come up with a theorem, say x. Meanwhile, I, also following the rules, come up with another theorem. It happens to be at tilde x. Can't you force yourself to conceive of that? Imprudence. Alright, let's suppose it happened. Why would it bother you? Or let me put it another way. Suppose that in playing with the MIU system, I came up with a theorem x, and you came up with xu. Can you force yourself to conceive of that? Prudence. Of course. In fact, both MI and MIU are theorems. Imprudence. Doesn't that bother you? Prudence. Of course not. Your example is ridiculous, because MI and MIU are not contradictory, whereas two strings x and tilde x in the propositional calculus are contradictory. Imprudence. Well, yes, provided you wish to interpret tilde as not. But what would lead you to think that tilde should be interpreted as not? Prudence. The rules themselves. When you look at them, you realize that the only conceivable interpretation for tilde is not, and likewise, the only conceivable interpretation for up angle bracket is and, etc. Imprudence. In other words, you are convinced that the rules capture the meanings of those words? Prudence. Precisely. Imprudence. And yet you are still willing to entertain the thought that both x and tilde x could be theorems? Why not also entertain the notion that hedgehogs are frogs, or that 1 equals 2, or that the moon is made of green cheese? I, for one, am not prepared even to consider whether such basic ingredients of my thought processes are wrong, because if I entertain that notion, then I would also have to consider whether my modes of analyzing the entire question are also wrong, and I would wind up in a total tangle. Prudence. Your arguments are forceful, yet I would still like to see a proof that all theorems come out true, or that x and tilde x can never both be theorems. Imprudence. You want a proof. I guess that means that you want to be more convinced that the propositional calculus is consistent than you are convinced of your own sanity. Any proof I could think of would involve mental operations of a greater complexity than anything in the propositional calculus itself. So what would it prove? Your desire for a proof of consistency of the propositional calculus makes me think of someone who is learning English and insists on being given a dictionary which defines all the simple words in terms of complicated ones. Alright, I'm gonna stop right here at the Carroll dialogue again. Man, when I first saw all the symbols, I was like, oh no, not again. But it wasn't that bad.